The year was 1953, and the Cold War felt as real as the bite of the desert air. Sergeant Daniel Hayes wiped the sweat from his brow as he scanned the horizon from the watchtower of Outpost Delta, a small military installation on the edge of Nevada's nuclear testing grounds. The sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked earth, and the men below moved sluggishly, their bodies weighed down by the heat and the constant drills. Despite the monotony, the tension in the air was palpable. Every soldier knew they were living in the shadow of an apocalyptic threat, though no one dared to speak of it. Hayes adjusted his binoculars, squinting at the shimmer of heat waves rising from the horizon. The radio crackled to life behind him, breaking the silence. "Routine airspace check," came the voice of Private Collins, stationed at the radar station. "All clear, Sarge." "Just the usual." Hayes grunted in response, his unease gnawing at him. Something felt off, though he couldn't put his finger on it. Down below, the men were gathered around a jeep, laughing as they passed around a cigarette. They were young, too young, Hayes thought. Kids barely out of high school, thrust into a world of geopolitical paranoia and mushroom clouds. He envied their ignorance. His own memories of the last war were still too fresh, the smell of burning flesh and gunpowder too vivid. He sighed and turned back to the horizon. The first sign was subtle, a strange distortion in the air, like the shimmer of a mirage, but different. Hayes froze, lowering the binoculars. His gut tightened. "Collins, anything unusual on the radar?" he barked into the radio. There was a pause before Collins responded, his voice tinged with confusion. "Negative, Sarge." "Wait, hold on. I'm picking up something. Fast moving. High altitude. Could be a..." The rest of the transmission was cut off as the alarms blared, a deafening wail that sent the entire outpost into chaos. Soldiers scrambled, their laughter replaced by shouts of confusion and fear. Hayes bolted down the watchtower ladder, his boots hitting the ground hard. "Everyone to your stations! Move!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the pandemonium. "Is it a drill?" one of the younger soldiers, Private Dawson, asked, his wide eyes betraying his terror. Hayes didn't answer. He didn't need to. The fear in his own chest told him this was no drill. A blinding flash lit up the sky, brighter than anything Hayes had ever seen. He instinctively dropped to the ground, shouting for the others to do the same. "Duck and cover!" he yelled, though the words felt hollow, a relic of government propaganda that promised safety in the face of the unthinkable. The light was followed by a deafening roar that shook the ground, the shockwave ripping through the outpost like a hurricane. Debris flew in every direction, and the air filled with the acrid stench of burning metal and flesh. Hayes struggled to his feet, his ears ringing and his vision blurred. The once orderly outpost was now a smoldering wasteland, the barracks reduced to rubble and the jeep overturned, its tires still spinning. Bodies lay scattered among the wreckage, some moving, most not. He stumbled toward Dawson, who was clutching his bleeding arm and staring blankly at the sky. "Private! Get up!" Hayes shouted, pulling him to his feet. The younger man looked at him, dazed, before nodding and staggering forward. Through the haze of dust and smoke, Hayes saw other survivors beginning to gather. Corporal Simmons, his face streaked with blood, was helping Collins limp toward what remained of the command center. "Sergeant, what the hell just happened?" Simmons asked, his voice trembling. Hayes didn't answer. He couldn't. Instead, he took stock of their situation. The communications equipment was destroyed, their vehicles were useless, and the air carried a strange metallic taste that made his throat burn. "Radiation," Hayes muttered under his breath, the realization hitting him like a punch to the gut. They were in the fallout zone. The safety pamphlets had never prepared them for this. They were always told the tests were controlled, the danger minimal. Lies, all of it. As night began to fall, the survivors gathered what supplies they could: water canteens, a few rifles, and the tattered remnants of a first aid kit. The once vibrant camaraderie of the unit had been replaced by grim determination. Hayes knew they couldn't stay here. The fallout would kill them if the radiation sickness didn't. But where could they go? The nearest town was miles away, and the desert was unforgiving. As they prepared to move out, a noise stopped them in their tracks. A low, guttural growl that sent chills down Hayes' spine. He raised his rifle, motioning for the others to stay quiet. Through the gloom, he saw them, figures moving through the wreckage, their shapes indistinct but menacing. At first, he thought they might be other survivors, but something about their movements was wrong. They were too calculated, too predatory. Hayes motioned for Simmons and Collins to flank him as he advanced cautiously. His heart pounded in his chest, the weight of the rifle suddenly feeling immense. As they drew closer, the figures came into focus. They weren't soldiers. At least, not American ones. Their uniforms were unfamiliar, their faces obscured by strange masks that seemed to filter the radioactive air. Enemy scouts, Hayes realized, here to ensure the job was finished. "Hold your fire," Hayes whispered, his voice barely audible. He knew they were outnumbered, outgunned, and already weakened by the blast. But the scouts hadn't seen them yet. They still had the element of surprise. Hayes gestured for his men to fall back, hoping to avoid a confrontation, but his foot caught on a piece of debris, sending it clattering across the ground. The figures turned sharply, their weapons raised. Hayes didn't hesitate. "Open fire!" he shouted, the crack of gunshots echoing through the ruins as the battle for survival began. The aftermath of the skirmish left Hayes and his men shaken. They had taken down 2 of the enemy scouts, their stealth suits riddled with bullet holes, but it had cost them. Private Dawson was slumped against a chunk of concrete, clutching at a bleeding wound on his side. Simmons crouched next to him, muttering reassurances while hastily wrapping gauze around the injury. Hayes scanned the darkness, rifle still in hand, adrenaline keeping him on edge. The enemy hadn't been expecting resistance, and for now, it seemed the rest had retreated. "Everyone okay?" Hayes asked, his voice low but firm. Simmons nodded grimly, but Collins was pale, his hands trembling as he reloaded his rifle. "We can't stay here," Hayes continued, his gaze flickering toward the horizon. "They'll be back, and they won't come alone. We need to move." Collins looked up, his voice shaky. "Move where, Sarge?" "Everything's gone. No vehicles, no comms. We're sitting ducks out here." Hayes frowned, his mind racing. He crouched next to one of the enemy scouts' bodies, pulling off the strange mask. The face beneath was young, almost boyish, but hardened by the same horrors Hayes had seen in his own men. He searched the scout's gear and found a map, partially burned but still legible. It showed marked locations in the area, one of which was circled in red. Annotations written in an unfamiliar language lined the margins. "What's this?" Simmons asked, peering over Hayes's shoulder. Hayes's eyes narrowed as he studied the map. "Looks like a rally point," he muttered. "If they're retreating, that's where they're headed. It's about 10 clicks west. If we're lucky, there might be something there we can use, transport, intel, maybe even a working radio. Or more of them waiting to kill us," Collins added bitterly. Hayes stood, rolling the map and tucking it into his jacket. "We don't have a choice. Staying here is suicide. If we can reach that point before they regroup, we might stand a chance." Reluctantly, the group gathered their meager supplies and began their trek through the desolate wasteland. The air was heavy with the metallic tang of fallout, and every step kicked up fine, radioactive dust. Hayes forced himself to keep moving, his boots crunching against the brittle earth. The night was deathly quiet, broken only by the sound of their labored breathing and the occasional cough. Hours passed, and the weight of exhaustion pressed down on them. Dawson's condition worsened, his movements sluggish as Simmons practically carried him. Collins stumbled frequently, his nerves frayed to the breaking point. Hayes kept his focus on the horizon, where the faint glow of firelight finally appeared, a flickering beacon in the endless dark. "There," Hayes said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's it. Get low. Stay quiet." They crouched behind a ridge overlooking the rally point. The scene below made Hayes's stomach twist. Enemy soldiers milled about a small encampment, their equipment far more advanced than anything his unit had. Vehicles with strange, sleek designs were parked near the edge of the site, and in the center stood a large, cylindrical device that glowed faintly. It was unlike anything Hayes had ever seen, its surface humming with an eerie blue light. "What the hell is that?" Simmons whispered, his eyes wide. "I don't know," Hayes replied, his tone grim. "But it's not good." As they watched, a group of enemy officers gathered around the device, gesturing and speaking in hushed tones. One of them held a briefcase, which he opened to reveal a small, intricate mechanism. Hayes recognized it immediately. It was a triggering device, something designed to arm a bomb. "This isn't just a rally point," Hayes said, his voice tight. "They're setting up for another strike." Collins's breath hitched. "Another nuke? Here?" "No," Hayes said, his mind working quickly. "They're using this site to stage an attack on something bigger. We need to stop them." "How?" Simmons asked, his frustration evident. "There's only 4 of us, and Dawson can barely stand." "We improvise," Hayes said. He gestured to the vehicles. "If we can get to one of those, we can cause enough of a distraction to destroy the device and get out of here." "And if we can't?" Collins asked, his voice dripping with skepticism. Hayes looked at him, his expression hard. "Then we die trying." The group crept down the ridge, moving as quietly as possible. Dawson, too weak to continue, stayed behind with a rifle, his pale face determined. "You go," he whispered. "I'll cover you if things go south." Hayes hesitated but nodded. "Stay sharp, Private." The 3 remaining soldiers approached the encampment, sticking to the shadows. Hayes's heart pounded as they reached the vehicles, their strange surfaces smooth and cool to the touch. He signaled to Simmons and Collins, who began rigging one of the fuel tanks with explosives scavenged from their limited supply. As they worked, an alarm suddenly blared. One of the enemy soldiers had spotted them. Chaos erupted as gunfire lit up the night, tracer rounds zipping through the air. Hayes fired back, taking cover behind one of the vehicles. "Blow it!" he shouted. Simmons hit the detonator, and the explosion was deafening. The shockwave knocked Hayes off his feet as the fuel tank erupted, sending a massive fireball into the sky. The encampment descended into chaos, the enemy scrambling as the glowing device began to spark and whine ominously. "Fall back!" Hayes yelled, grabbing Collins and dragging him toward the ridge. They ran as fast as their legs could carry them, bullets whizzing past. Behind them, the cylindrical device emitted a high-pitched scream before exploding in a blinding flash of blue light, consuming the entire camp in a wave of destruction. Hayes and his men barely made it over the ridge before the shockwave hit, throwing them to the ground. When the dust settled, the rally point was gone, replaced by a smoking crater. Hayes looked at his men, exhausted, battered but alive. "Mission accomplished," he muttered, though the words felt hollow. He knew this was only the beginning. The world was a cacophony of silence in the wake of the explosion. The glow from the crater below cast eerie shadows over the ridge where Sergeant Hayes and his surviving soldiers lay sprawled. Their breaths came in ragged gasps, the dust choking the air around them. For a brief moment, none of them moved, their minds struggling to process the chaos they had just escaped. Hayes was the first to stir, rolling onto his hands and knees. His body ached, his muscles screaming with every movement, but there was no time to rest. The enemy might be obliterated for now, but reinforcements would come. They always did. He crawled over to Simmons, who was clutching his arm where shrapnel had torn through his uniform. Blood seeped through his fingers, but he was alive. Collins was already sitting up, coughing violently as he tried to shake the dust from his lungs. "Is it over?" Collins croaked, his voice hoarse and brittle. His wide eyes darted toward the smoldering ruins of the enemy encampment. "Did we stop it?" Hayes glanced toward the horizon. The destruction of the camp was a victory, but his gut told him it wasn't the end. The device's explosion had sent a massive plume of smoke and ash into the air, one that would no doubt attract attention. He couldn't shake the image of that strange cylindrical device, the glow, the hum, the eerie power it radiated. That wasn't just a bomb. It was something far worse. For now, Hayes said tersely, his gaze snapping back to his men. We need to keep moving. The enemy will come looking for us, and I doubt they'll be in the mood to negotiate. What about Dawson? Simmons asked, his voice thick with guilt. Hayes hesitated, his jaw clenching. Dawson had stayed behind on the ridge, rifle in hand, determined to buy them time. They hadn't seen him since the explosion, and Hayes knew what that likely meant. Still, leaving him behind gnawed at his conscience. He made his choice, Hayes said finally, his voice low. And we honor it by surviving. Now get up. We're not out of this yet. They scavenged what little they could from their supplies, a few canteens of water, a handful of ammunition, and the map Hayes had taken from the scout. With no vehicles and no clear destination, their only option was to head toward the nearest marked location on the map. It was a long shot, but it was better than wandering aimlessly through the radioactive wasteland. The journey was grueling. Every step was a battle against fatigue, hunger, and the ever-present threat of radiation poisoning. The desert, once desolate and quiet, now seemed alive with danger. Shadows moved on the edges of their vision, and strange sounds echoed in the distance, whispers of a world that had been irrevocably altered by mankind's hubris. As dawn broke, the group reached an abandoned mining facility carved into the side of a rocky bluff. The entrance was partially collapsed, but it offered shelter from the relentless sun and the watchful eyes of enemy patrols. They stumbled inside, collapsing against the cool stone walls. Simmons pulled out a small flashlight, its weak beam cutting through the darkness. Think anyone's been here recently? He asked, his voice echoing faintly. Doesn't matter, Hayes said, slumping against the wall. We're here now. Rest while you can. We move again in an hour. Collins sat down heavily, his rifle resting across his knees. I don't know how much more of this I can take, Sarge, he said, his voice shaking. I keep thinking about home, you know? My mom, my little sister. They'll never know what happened to us out here. Hayes didn't respond immediately. He leaned his head back against the wall, staring up at the crumbling ceiling. He thought of his own family, a wife he hadn't seen in over a year, a daughter who had just learned to walk when he'd left. The memory was like a knife twisting in his chest. He forced the thoughts aside, burying them beneath the steel resolve that had kept him alive this long. They'll know, Hayes said quietly. When this is over, they'll know we didn't give up. That we fought until the end. Before Collins could respond, the sound of distant engines rumbled through the silence. Hayes tensed, his hand instinctively reaching for his rifle. The noise grew louder, the unmistakable growl of enemy vehicles echoing through the canyon outside the mine. They found us, Simmons whispered, his face pale. Hayes stood, his exhaustion forgotten. Collins, take position by the entrance. Simmons, cover the rear. We're not going down without a fight. Collins scrambled to the entrance, peering out cautiously. 3 vehicles, he reported, his voice tight. Heavily armed. Looks like they're sweeping the area. Hayes's mind raced. They were outnumbered and outgunned, and their only advantage was the narrow confines of the mine. He glanced around, his eyes landing on a stack of rusted mining equipment. Among the debris was a crate marked explosives. Simmons, Hayes said, a plan forming in his mind. Get those charges ready. If they come in here, we'll collapse the entrance. And trap ourselves inside? Simmons asked, incredulous. Better than getting torn apart out there. Hayes snapped. Do it. The next few minutes were a blur of preparation. Simmons rigged the charges while Collins and Hayes watched the enemy vehicles inch closer. Hayes's heart pounded as he steadied his rifle, his finger hovering over the trigger. When the first enemy soldier appeared, Hayes fired. The shot rang out, striking the soldier in the chest and sending him crumpling to the ground. Chaos erupted as the remaining soldiers returned fire, bullets ricocheting off the rocks. Simmons, now! Hayes shouted. The charges detonated with a thunderous roar, sending a cascade of rocks crashing down over the mine's entrance. Dust and debris filled the air as the group retreated deeper into the darkness. For a moment, everything was silent. Hayes lit a flare, its red glow illuminating the hollowed-out tunnel. "We'll find another way out," he said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. "We always do." The red glow of the flare painted the jagged walls of the mine with an ominous light, the shadows flickering like restless ghosts. The sound of collapsing rocks at the entrance faded into a suffocating silence, broken only by the ragged breaths of Sergeant Hayes and his men. They were trapped, but alive, for now. Hayes scanned the dimly lit tunnel, his sharp gaze catching every detail. The air was heavy, thick with dust, and the faint tang of something metallic. This mine wasn't just abandoned, it was ancient, a relic from another era, left to rot beneath the weight of time and secrecy. Collins sat slumped against the wall, cradling his rifle like a lifeline. His hands shook uncontrollably as he tried to steady his breathing. Simmons leaned against the opposite wall, blood seeping through the crude bandage on his arm. He looked up at Hayes, his face pale but determined. "You've got a plan, right, Sarge?" he asked, his voice tinged with desperation. Hayes ignored the question for a moment, focusing on the sound, or rather, the absence of it. The enemy outside wasn't firing anymore. That was both a relief and a concern. Either they assumed the collapse had done its job, or they were regrouping, planning something worse. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to think clearly. They needed to keep moving. Staying here was a death sentence. "Let's focus on survival first," Hayes said finally. "This mine probably has secondary exits. Old regulations required them in case of cave-ins. If we can find one, we can get out before the radiation or the enemy catches up to us." Collins let out a bitter laugh. "And if we don't? We just die of thirst or suffocate down here." Hayes crouched in front of Collins, grabbing his shoulder firmly. "We don't die. Not here, not now. You hear me? Keep it together." Collins swallowed hard, nodding reluctantly. Hayes stood, his eyes flickering to Simmons. "We move. Grab what you can carry and stay close." They set off into the mine, the flare casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to follow them like silent predators. The deeper they went, the colder the air became, and the walls grew slick with moisture. Every creak and groan of the earth above them sent shivers down their spines, a grim reminder of their precarious situation. After what felt like hours of navigating the twisting tunnels, they stumbled upon something unexpected, a cavernous chamber. The space was massive, the ceiling lost in darkness. In the center of the room stood an abandoned mining rig, rusted and forgotten, its towering frame draped in cobwebs. Scattered around it were crates, tools, and barrels marked with faded symbols that Hayes didn't recognize. Simmons shone his flashlight on one of the crates, revealing a symbol that made Hayes's stomach churn, a radioactive warning symbol. "This isn't just any mine," Simmons said, his voice hushed. "This was a uranium mine." Hayes nodded grimly. "Makes sense. The government probably abandoned it when the risks outweighed the rewards." Collins took a step back, his face pale. "So we're walking through a radiation pit? Great. Just great. Stay calm," Hayes ordered. "The radiation levels down here are probably low. The real danger is getting stuck here." As they searched the chamber, Hayes noticed something peculiar. One of the crates was newer, the wood less weathered and the nails pristine. He pried it open with the butt of his rifle, revealing a stash of equipment that was anything but old. Inside were sleek devices, some resembling advanced Geiger counters, others looking like components for something far more sinister. "What the hell is this?" Simmons asked, peering over Hayes's shoulder. Hayes shook his head, his expression darkening. "It's not ours, that's for sure. The enemy must have been using this place as a staging ground for something. This wasn't just a mine, it's a cache." Collins's voice trembled. "So what do we do? Blow it up?" Hayes considered the idea but shook his head. "Not yet. If there's a map or a clue about their operations, we need it. We can't let this war end in their favor." Before they could investigate further, a distant sound reached them, a low rumble, faint but unmistakable. Hayes froze, his senses on high alert. The sound grew louder, accompanied by a rhythmic thudding that echoed through the tunnels. It was machinery, and it was moving fast. "They're coming," Hayes said, his voice tight. "They must have found another way in." Simmons grabbed his rifle, his jaws set. "How many do you think?" "Enough to finish the job," Hayes replied grimly. "We need to rig this place to blow and find that exit." They worked quickly, using the explosives they had salvaged earlier. Hayes set charges around the cache, ensuring that if the enemy got too close, they wouldn't leave with anything useful. The tension was suffocating as the sound of approaching vehicles and boots echoed louder through the tunnels. Finally, they found a narrow passage leading upward. It was steep and treacherous, but it offered a glimmer of hope. Hayes ushered Collins and Simmons forward, covering their retreat as the first enemy scouts entered the chamber below. Shouts in a foreign language echoed through the cavern, followed by gunfire as the soldiers discovered the cache. "Go!" Hayes barked, pushing Collins forward as he hit the detonator. The explosion rocked the mine, a deafening roar that sent a shockwave through the tunnels. The ground shook violently, and the lights from the enemy's flashlights disappeared in an instant, swallowed by the collapsing chamber. The group scrambled upward, the passage crumbling behind them. Rocks and debris rained down, forcing them to move faster despite their exhaustion. At last they emerged into the pale light of dawn, gasping for air as they stumbled onto the surface. The desert stretched out before them, vast and empty. Smoke rose in the distance from the mine's entrance, a grim testament to their struggle. Hayes leaned against a boulder, his chest heaving. Simmons and Collins collapsed nearby, their faces etched with relief and exhaustion. "We made it," Simmons said, his voice barely above a whisper. "For now," Hayes replied, scanning the horizon. "But this isn't over. Not by a long shot." In the distance, the faint hum of aircraft engines reached his ears, a reminder that the war they were fighting had no end in sight.